Welcome to the 2020 launch of the IISS Armed Conflict Survey, the comprehensive reference on armed conflict worldwide. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm the Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development, and also the co-editor of this year's edition of the book, together with Dr. Francesca Grandi. Before we begin, well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today from all over the world. And second, we have a couple of housekeeping points. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and we'll do our best to respond to as many of those questions in the course of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the IISS website and also on our YouTube channel in about 24 hours, just in case you want to point your colleagues to the recording. If you'd like more information about the Armed Conflict Survey and how to order it in either book or ebook form, please use the link on the screen or simply go to the IISS website or on Amazon. Today, I'm joined by 5 of my colleagues. They are Emil, Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, Aaron Connolly, a Research Fellow in Southeast Asian Political Change and Foreign Policy, Antoine Levesque, Research Fellow for South Asia, Antonio Sampaio, Research Fellow for Conflict Security and Development, who will be focusing on Latin America, and Dr. Eleanor Beaver, Research Associate for Conflict Security and Development, who will be focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa. After my overview of the book, I will bring them in the conversation and we'll discuss some of the key developments from their respective regions. Now in its 6th edition, the Armed Conflict Survey covers the key events and developments in all active conflicts across 6 global regions in 2019, providing in-depth analysis of the political, military, and humanitarian dimensions of each of those 33 conflicts. With each edition, we strive to make the book even more accessible to our readership. And as a result, the book includes more than 60 full color maps. And you can see a couple of examples here of Libya and Syria, South Sudan, and the Philippines. We also have plenty of tables and infographics highlighting key conflict developments and data, and also timelines of the key political and military events in 2019. With this edition, we've also introduced a new feature. Each regional chapter begins with an overview of key trends, strategic implications, and prospects for peace. Naturally, we acknowledge that trends evolve and linger for longer than our 12-month time frame. But there are 3 things that really stood out for us in 2019. First, our decision to include dedicated sections on the strategic implications of all conflicts reflects the consolidation of a trend that we have been monitoring closely, and that is the substantial internationalization of many conflicts, which increasingly often involve regional and international actors that use the battleground to pursue their rivalries. In so doing, stakes often grow higher and the strategic repercussions of events can reverberate much further afield. So for instance, in the book, we reflect on how attacks by Baloch insurgents against Chinese interests in Pakistan put significant pressure on Islamabad and frustrate Beijing. Similarly, we look at the many global powers that see the conflict in Libya as an opportunity to expand their influence in the Mediterranean. Second, it was clear that non-state armed actors were the main protagonists of most conflicts in 2019. Notably, in 21 out of the 33 conflicts, the number of non-state armed groups exceeds the number of state groups. Acknowledging that, we have expanded our coverage of armed groups, producing detailed profiles and infographics that help explain the complex relations among the many actors fighting on the ground. Additionally, this year's Armed Conflict Survey includes 4 thematic essays that provide an understanding of the changing nature of armed groups and the emerging and likely enduring trends that characterize their operations. Specifically, experts discuss groups' increasingly horizontal structures, their propensity for exploiting technology, including UAVs or drones, and their adaptability, specifically looking at the case of ISIS, exploiting the networks once used to guarantee the flow of fighters to Syria and Iraq, to now facilitate their movements into other conflict zones. And finally, we look at groups exploiting the business opportunities presented by conflict, notably to traffic human beings. Third is the prolonged nature of many conflicts, which we visually highlight in the chart of armed conflict that accompanies the book. As we represent at the very top of the chart, 12 out of 33 active conflicts started in the previous decades, while more than 60% of conflicts have been ongoing for 10 years or even longer. This, of course, raises questions about the prospects for conflict resolution in 2020. Analysis in this armed conflict survey suggests some glimpses of hope, which should, however, not lead to complacency. For instance, in Colombia, despite the presence and actions of FARC dissidents, the peace agreement between the government and the left-wing guerrilla group is likely to remain in place. And in Egypt, the insurgency targeting the Sinai Peninsula is losing fighting power. And violence in the Central African Republic and Sudan has decreased compared to the previous year. In Pakistan, violence by the Taliban Pakistan has declined, and 2019 marked the first year since 2003 without Pakistani or American airstrikes. Perhaps more significant, however, was the lead up to the historic deal the Taliban and the US government reached in February 2020. Following long months of negotiations, the agreement appeared to bring hope for the resolution of Afghanistan's nearly 2-decade-long conflict. But the brutal violence that we have seen in the immediate aftermath was a stark reminder of the fragility and complexity of peace deals. Indeed, the challenge of implementing peace agreements remained a very tangible one in 2019, as evidence from Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Mali clearly indicates. The fragmentation of negotiating parties, often backed by different international actors, and capacity shortcomings, such as limited ability to reintegrate former armed groups into society, have proved serious obstacles to the implementation of many agreements. Producing the armed conflict survey is an iterative process involving constant monitoring and data verification. As such, the thinking around the 2021 edition is already underway to assess which instances of instability might meet our criteria and be included as new conflicts, and also how broader trends such as the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic can, both directly and indirectly, exacerbate conflict and fragility, and also undermine prospects for conflict resolution. The Armed Conflict Survey researchers and the broader IISS research team are monitoring and will continue to monitor these evolving issues through written analysis, as well as regular podcasts and webinars, which you can access on our website. I would now like to turn to our experts to really help us tease out how the trends that I've just briefly presented, they show themselves in their respective regions. First, I would like to look at the Middle East, and I would like to invite my colleague Emil to discuss with me some of these issues. So one of the trends that I've tried to highlight, Emil, is really the role of regional actors and how some of those regional rivalries play out in many conflicts around the world. Can you tell us really to what extent in some of the major wars in the Middle East, i.e. Syria, Libya, and Yemen, those regional rivalries are driving and fueling the conflicts?
Thank you, Virginia, and good afternoon to all. The conflicts in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, as we illustrate in the ACS this year, are still fully regionalized conflicts. In the sense that external regional powers, whether they're immediate bordering powers or one or two countries away, are primary funders, providers of weaponry, provide political covers, etc., for the various local parties. They don't necessarily; those regional powers don't necessarily exert command and control over all or the majority of local fighting groups. But they do play a qualitative role in essentially the ups and downs of the conflict. Libya is a great example, especially that the fighting is on right now. What we've seen in the past year, but in fact the trend goes back to 2014, 2015, but in the past year in particular, we saw a seesaw in Libya where one side led by Khalifa Haftar has made considerable advances, in large part thanks to Egyptian, Emirati, Russian, and to some extent even French support against the government, the UN recognized a backed government in Tripoli that is backed primarily by Turkey. And so those two coalitions have been able to deploy mercenaries, especially from Syria, but also important technology on the battlefield that explains why Haftar was, for instance, able to move all the way to Tripoli, but now is taking considerable losses and backing away because Turkish support in terms of troops, in terms of weapon systems, has really increased. Syria is another good example where we saw late last year and early this year, Turkey essentially providing massive firepower in the form of air power, drones, and ground support to its own Syrian rebel partners. So the interests of these various powers are still very strong in these different arenas. They are present in these arenas in some parts because their regional competitors are present, so they cannot afford not to be present. And so it creates this pervert cycle of violence where escalation follows escalation and so on. But the question here is who has staying power, who is able to put together a stable coalition of forces and then drive the political agenda. And just to finish on this point, it's even when regional powers decide to dial down their engagement, this is not a guarantee that fighting will substantively decrease. And one good example is Yemen, where the UAE has considerably lowered its presence to the extent that actually it has withdrawn from most front lines. And Saudi Arabia has essentially withdrew from much of the fighting. And yet fighting in Yemen in the past couple of months has increased because local fighters, when they perceive that a regional sponsor is leaving the scene, has either weakened or the opposing party sees an opportunity to move on. So regional powers are not the only driver of violence, but they do introduce important resources, technology, and firepower that does make a difference.
Thank you, Emil. So, I mean, against this very complex and not very happy backdrop, so does the UN mediation actually stand a chance to decrease levels of violence and perhaps move towards political settlements? Is there any optimism here?
It's difficult to be optimistic. The UN processes are really struggling to be relevant and keep up with the changes on the battlefield. In Syria, the main UN effort today is the Constitutional Committee, which is really a sideshow compared to the massive changes on the battlefield that are occurring. And the UN is marginally present in the diplomacy between Turkey, Iran, Russia, and others. In Libya, the UN up until April 2019 was actually able to articulate a vision and had was about to put a process on the table that seemed solid, and then the ambition of one side, in this case Khalifa Haftar, essentially totally derailed this process. And today the UN again is irrelevant to the point where the UN Special Envoy resigned over this because he saw no real traction for this. In Yemen, the UN has been able to negotiate an important de-escalation agreement over the port city of Hodeidah. The fear was that if there were massive fighting in Hodeidah, this would have a massive humanitarian impact because it's the entry point for most of the humanitarian aid and the food and so on into this starved country. But starting in Hodeidah in a narrow agreement did not broaden, and there was no real nationwide effort here. So again, the UN is not really present in the south when there is a new secessionist movement. It's not present on the front line in Ma'arib. So again, the UN is struggling. It's struggling in part because the mandates are weak, differ widely one from the other. In part, it's because even when the UN has taken steps, they're not being implemented. And I think the important bit here is to look at embargoes. There's an embargo in Yemen against the Houthi movement, and it's actually being implemented, but it does favor the other party. There's an embargo in Libya, but it's being violated by everyone. There's not even the pretense that the embargo is. So we go back to the fundamental issue, one of political will. The UN Security Council is paralyzed. Russia is the paralyzing factor on Syria. The US, to some extent, is a paralyzing factor on Yemen. France, to a lesser extent, is a paralyzing factor on Libya. So, you know, the politics at the global and regional levels are still extremely tense. And this is why the UN is essentially largely irrelevant in many of these arenas.
Thank you, Emil. I'd like now to move from the Middle East and North Africa down to Sub-Saharan Africa and bring in Dr. Eleanor Beaver. But I would still like to remain on this theme of, you know, the many efforts that have been attempted to bring some of these conflicts to an end. So we have seen over the course of 2019, Ella, some apparently successful peacemaking efforts across Africa. So what do they tell us? Is the situation changing for the better?
Thanks very much, Virginia. Good afternoon, everyone. It's difficult to sum this up, but certainly one of the themes that we explore in this year's Conflict Survey is the global proliferation of non-state armed groups and equally the rise of many smaller groups. And this is fragmenting conflict landscapes that were already extremely complicated, which in turn is going to make peacemaking much harder. But still, we do have a few successes, or at least partial successes, to point to and learn from. And to bounce off Emil's point about political will, that's equally when the state is still able to intervene in Africa, we've seen that political will really does matter. For instance, in Nigeria, we've seen a significant reduction in violence between farmers and pastoralists in 2019. And that is in large part because local authorities got more involved in peacemaking. For a sort of reverse example, we can look to Cameroon in 2019. We've seen President Biya's refusal to make political compromises drag on the conflict, but without benefiting the opposition Anglophone armed groups, both the Federalists and the Secessionists. We've seen that cluster of movement fragment over what to do now that there's no obvious path to peace, and that fragmentation will obviously make any future peace-building attempts much harder. What we've also seen, though, is that very imperfect peace processes can at least lead to substantial reductions in violence, although perhaps at a price of freezing political solutions, at least for a while. For instance, in the Central African Republic in 2019, 14 rebel groups signed a peace agreement with the government. The obvious problem with that accord is that it effectively rewarded the key warlords for their violence with political position, and it sets the precedent that violence is the fastest route if you want to access power and resources. Now, we've already seen some of the major rebel signatories, party to those peace processes, start to splinter, and we've seen civilians caught in the crossfire of those attacks between rebel groups. The other problem with this peace agreement is that it makes advancing any judicial process to investigate war crimes almost impossible. Nevertheless, we can't argue with a major reduction in violence. That shouldn't be dismissed. And that's partly a result of local peacekeeping efforts alongside the national one. I think the key lesson here is that we need to be quite realistic about what weak or captured states can do in short periods of time. That doesn't necessarily force a choice between peace or political advancement, but I think it does mean being prepared to accept much longer, slower transitions than we might like to see.
Thanks, Nella. So a big focus of the book and our work is on armed groups. Have you seen any changes in the behaviors or tactics of some of these armed groups that have significantly impacted the course of existing conflicts? And perhaps even more interestingly, have you seen situations where the new tactics of new behaviors might lead to new conflicts to emerge?
We've certainly seen growth in both numbers and in sophistication of certain key armed groups. Regrettably, the clearest examples of this are those affiliated with ISIS, Islamic State on the continent. So after the destruction of ISIS's physical caliphate, it announced that its new global strategy would be to wear down enemy nations through persistent attacks, and it referred to this as the so-called battle of attrition. Now, in both Eastern and Western Africa, ISIS has won battles of perception this year. It managed to put its brand on conflicts which have escalated very rapidly in 2019. So in West Africa, we saw a merger between ISIS West Africa province with ISIS in the Greater Sahara. And in East Africa, we saw the announcement of a new affiliate, the so-called ISIS Central Africa province, in April 2019. And they began by claiming credit for attacks that happened in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And just a couple of months later, that so-called province nominally expanded to include the still very poorly understood jihadist group fighting in northern Mozambique. But I think sort of despite this pattern of ISIS creating these big symbolic entities on each side of the continent, the picture on the ground is still quite different. Both provinces encompass different insurgencies that coordinate little, if at all, and the motives that drive individual fighters at a local level will be varied, but they'll be very heavily influenced by inequality, poor governance, lacks of opportunities, and other more local circumstances. In northern Mozambique, to come back to your question about tactics and so on, we've seen a very remarkable evolution of the insurgency in the last 6 months or so. They've gone from a force that periodically committed attacks against civilian villages and government troops to one that can capture key towns for short periods of time and use that capture to broadcast their message to the population. But as much as things change, they also stay the same. Major offences were conducted by the Congolese army between November 2019 and this January against what was believed to be the main base camp of Congo's Islamists. That offensive has no doubt damaged the group, but sadly it hasn't stopped horrific attacks against civilians. And this is a pattern that we've in fact seen repeat itself several times long before any ISIS affiliation happened. As the Congolese army steps up, attacks against civilians are increased to undermine support for those military operations.
Thank you very much, Nella. Let's just cross the Atlantic now, but I'd like to remain on this theme of groups' behaviors and the changes that we've observed in the violence. So Antonio Sampaio, so back in 2016, the peace agreed between the FARC and the Colombian government provided finally some hope that insurgency was on its way out in Latin America. But then fast forward to 2019 or 2020, levels of violence in the country are still high, and Colombia is still featured in the Armed Conflict Survey. So can you tell us how that violence, armed violence, has changed, please?
Thank you, Virginia. Indeed, despite several splinter groups of the FARC guerrilla continuing to operate in rural areas of Colombia, the peace process has successfully decommissioned thousands of weapons, set up a transition mechanism for demobilized fighters. But what we have seen over the past year is that the long-standing weakness of state institutions and the lure of illicit economies, particularly, of course, coca cultivation and cocaine trafficking, have boosted the presence of other armed groups. These include not only FARC dissident groups, of which there are several, but also the National Liberation Army, another guerrilla group, and criminal groups, especially the Gulf Clan, the Clan del Golfo, which is currently the largest criminal group in Colombia. And the attempt at a peace negotiation with the ELN, which is now the largest remaining guerrilla organization in Colombia, was called off in January 2019 after the group conducted a car bomb, a really devastating car bomb attack on a police academy in Bogota that killed 23 people. The group is now the largest remaining insurgent force in anywhere in the Americas, though much smaller than the FARC. The ELN is estimated to have about 3,000 members right now. So geographically, as I hope you'll be able to see in the map that is being displayed, the armed violence involving both guerrilla groups and the criminal groups is concentrated in three main areas. So to the west, on the Pacific coast, there is the area where the dissident FARC groups have been particularly active along this Pacific coast, including both rural and urban areas. Two quite strategic towns, the port towns of Tumaco and Buenaventura, are good examples. So Tumaco is a long-standing hub for illicit economies and organized crime. So it has seen this mixture of old and new conflict dynamics. So the illicit economies and organized crime going through the port in Tumaco has continued. And in the past year, we have seen dissident FARC factions, including the Oliver Sinisterra Front and the United Guerrillas of the Pacific, expanding into Tumaco and recruiting new members as well as demobilized FARC fighters. At the center of the country towards the north, around Medellin, you have the rural area called the Nudo de Paramillo, particularly the Barro Cauca area, which again is a good illustration of the web of armed groups in Colombia. Early 2009 was a particularly violent period for this region due to the conflict being waged between the Gulf Clan and the Caparapos, a local criminal organization. Again, the Caparapos are a good example of how transition from conflict is different in Colombia, because the group emerged in the late 2000s and benefited from recruiting demobilized or some not so demobilized paramilitary, right-wing paramilitary forces that sign agreements with the government around the late 2000s. And right now, the Caparapos are again benefiting from the demobilization of the FARC fighters, making deals and agreements with the dissident fronts. And finally, along the Venezuelan border, there is the area known as Catatumbo, again, a long-standing area of illicit economies, thriving via drug trafficking and smuggling of several projects through this very porous border. And the problem has been compounded by the rising demand for illicit groups to smuggle Venezuelan migrants through the border, as well as by the long-standing weak law enforcement and lack of economic opportunities, particularly on the Venezuelan side of the border. And there, the ELN has been particularly strong. It has been particularly strong. So what we have seen in Colombia, to summarize, is this fragmentation among a diverse array of armed groups. And even more than before, the criminal motivations and illicit economies are important drivers, given the importance of the criminal aspect to the dissident FARC groups, whose ideological or political aims remain nebulous. We don't quite know how political and ideological they are right now.
Thank you, Antonio. Of course, you've been focusing on Colombia, but there are other countries across Latin America that are seeing very high levels of violence. And one that has caused quite a lot of concerns is Brazil. And just a little footnote on that, Brazil is one of the conflicts that we have included more recently. And originally, we were only focusing on the urban conflict in Rio de Janeiro, and this year reflecting how similarly high levels of violence have been reported elsewhere. The conflict also includes the violence in the northern state of Ceará, and particularly its main city of Fortaleza. So that footnote aside, so as I was saying, Brazil, the situation in Brazil has been particularly concerning also because we have seen the political discourse and some policies that have been promoted that really argue for a very aggressive and repressive approach against violence, against crime. Has this approach worked?
So Brazil has indeed experienced a very steep decline in violence measured as homicide numbers. But it is unclear so far if public policies implemented at the national level have played a role in it. So President Jair Bolsonaro has been very vocal about the need for tougher measures against crime, but the public security bill that was the main deliverable of his government so far in terms of security that passed through Congress focused mostly on reforms of the criminal justice legislation, implementing especially tougher prison sentences. So a highly repressive and not preventative focus of security policies. And the day-to-day fight against the well-armed, well-organized criminal groups continues to be handled by police forces and state governments. One clear trend that we can identify throughout most areas of Brazil during the past years that this reduction in homicides has been a trend since 2008. So after 2017, which was the year when Brazil registered the highest number of homicides in its recent history, over 60,000 total homicides in 2017, 55,000 of which were intentional. So the base of comparison is quite high, and the number of deaths for that reason are still high despite the recent declines. But there are reasons for concern in Brazil that go beyond numbers. The character of armed violence and organized crime has also changed in many states. States like Ceará, as you mentioned, which is in the northeast of Brazil, and Amazonas state have seen in recent years the emergence of well-armed and organized criminal groups operating drug trafficking. So the same type of armed group that tended to be almost an exclusivity in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, in recent years have expanded and replicated themselves in other states of Brazil. So the case of Ceará in the Northeast is a good illustration of that. The state registered a steep decline in homicides last year, which is good, but also saw two separate waves of criminal attacks against government and civilian targets in January and September. So the attacks targeted buses, cars, fuel stations in a way that ground to a halt parts of the city of Fortaleza, which is the fifth largest city in terms of population in Brazil. So the attacks were carried out in coordination by different criminal groups in alliance, which is also why, probably why the homicides in the state of Ceará have declined due to this truce between the different criminal groups. But that doesn't mean necessarily an improvement in security in general, because they're still able to challenge state authority and conduct violent attacks in such a daring, such a bold manner. So even though homicides decline, the character of organized crime in parts of Brazil has become more organized than before. And this is why the case of Ceará and Fortaleza in particular is covered in this year's book. And in the case of Rio de Janeiro, again, we have seen a decline in homicides, but security policies have reverted to a highly repressive and militarized approach. And this has contributed to an increase of 18% last year in the deaths resulting from police intervention in the state of Rio, which means that over 1,800 people, 1,814 people to be more precise, were killed by police officers in the state of Rio de Janeiro last year, the highest number ever registered in the state. So therefore, to summarize, armed violence in Brazil has indeed registered some modest improvement, but at the same time, organized crime and security forces are still engaged in very violent confrontations.
Thank you, Antonio. Very clear. I'd like now to move to Asia and to bring in Aaron Connolly. Aaron, when people think of your region, Southeast Asia, most would be familiar with the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar. But can you bring us up to speed on the intense fighting that we saw between the Myanmar armed forces and the Arakan army over the course of 2019?
Sure. Thanks, Virginia, and good evening, everyone. I think it's useful to think about the conflict in Rakhine State as really three different conflicts. There's long been a history of intermittent conflict between the ethnic Rakhine population in Rakhine State, who are mostly Buddhist, and then the Rohingya population, who are mostly Muslim, dating back to before World War II. That is the conflict that flared up in 2012, and we saw 140,000 displaced then. We then saw a conflict between the center, between the Myanmar armed forces, the Tatmadaw, and Rohingya civilians, really not between them, but really directed by the Myanmar armed forces at the Rohingya civilian population in Rakhine State in 2017. And that's the conflict that most people are familiar with because it led to 700,000 Rohingya fleeing to Bangladesh. But there's also this third conflict that has become the fiercest fighting in Myanmar over the past year. And that's between the center, between the Bamar Buddhist majority of the center and the Myanmar armed forces that represent them, and Aung San Suu Kyi's government that represents them, and the ethnic Rakhine in Rakhine State. And this really began to pick up speed in early 2018 when Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD government handled very badly a series of incidents regarding Rakhine nationalism. So Dr. A. Mong, the leader of the former leader of the Arakan National Party, Arakan being a homonym for Rakhine, was arrested on treason charges and ultimately sentenced to 20 years in jail for a speech in which he accused the NLD government of treating them like slaves. At that point, the Arakan army, which had existed since 2009, but had not really been much of a force in Rakhine State, began to pick up a lot of speed as a result of the resentment that was being directed against Aung San Suu Kyi's government and against the Myanmar armed forces. And in late 2017, we saw some very fierce fighting, including air attacks on Arakan army positions in Rakhine State. It's a different conflict than a lot of the conflicts on Myanmar's periphery. There are about 20 ethnic armed groups in Myanmar's periphery, but when it comes to the Arakan army, they don't fight like these other ethnic armed groups. They don't hold fixed positions. They don't hold territory for very long, or they at least aren't as dependent upon it. And they tend to fight more like guerrillas. And partly as a result, although partly perhaps for political reasons, the NLD government designated them a terrorist organization in April. But this is a very different kind of fighting than Myanmar is used to. There have been atrocities on both sides, and 140,000 people are now displaced, mostly ethnic Rakhine in Rakhine State are now displaced, although Rohingya have come in between the crossfire as well, have gotten caught in between the crossfire as well. And so it seems likely to drag on like this. There's no sign of the broad popular support for the Arakan army in Rakhine State dissipating anytime soon.
Thank you, Aaron. One of the themes that we discuss at length in the book is the involvement of external actors. Myanmar as a very big and important neighbor. Can you tell us what role China has played into the fighting, into the conflict?
Look, China has really made itself absolutely central to the conflicts in Myanmar. And it does that formally through taking the role of a facilitator of peace negotiations. Sun Guoxiang, China's special envoy to the peace negotiations, has intimate contacts with all of the ethnic armed groups. But at the same time, China is cultivating a relationship with the NLD government in Naypyidaw, led by Aung San Suu Kyi. And although it's just outside the scope of this book, it was being prepared in late 2019. Xi Jinping visited Myanmar in January, his first visit as president of the PRC. But just days before, Sun Guoxiang was meeting with the Arakan army at their headquarters. And so it plays a sort of interesting double game. The Arakan army has been accused of being a Chinese proxy. I think that is a step too far. It was created as a kind of proxy for the Kachin Independence Army in 2009, which has very close links to the PRC and uses the PRC for a kind of strategic backfield. But it's not really a proxy of China in the sense that China can order it to stop the fighting, although it may be using its connections with the Arakan army as leverage with Myanmar in negotiations over these Belt and Road projects. One really big one, which is in Rakhine State, the big port at Chakpu, which was a source of considerable tension between Myanmar and China over the past year. So it's a little bit unclear what China's intentions are with regard to its relationship with both the Arakan army and with Myanmar.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And let's remain in Asia, but let's go to South Asia and bring in Antoine Levesque. Last but not least, there was some very key development in your region. One is something already I've alluded to in my introduction, and has to do with Afghanistan. And the book really discusses some early prospects for peace in the country. And early this year, we saw what really looked like a major breakthrough. And since then, we've also seen a number of unprecedented developments in Afghanistan. So Antoine, do you think that the strategic direction of the conflict in Afghanistan has changed irreversibly? Is this a brand new phase?
Thank you, Virginia, and good afternoon to you all. To answer your question, Afghanistan features as one of 5 conflicts in the Armed Conflict Survey this year. And as you stated in your introduction, the prospects are mixed. I think to answer your question, you have to arc back to the 2 main conclusions which the Afghanistan section reaches. One is that the protracted nature of the conflict, the strategic stalemate, will likely persist on the ground for the foreseeable future. The second additional scenario, which really could prove a game changer, is that to do with the question of reconciliation in presence of a US withdrawal. The Afghan conflict is familiar to many of you. The numbers accumulated over the years in terms of fatalities, human suffering, but also the military outcomes are well understood. So really what we must be looking at now is this question of the US-led military diplomatic intervention underway formally since the beginning of this year, but which the book documents amply in 2019, revolving around reconciliation. And what we really have seen in 2020, beyond the instances of heightened violence in 2019, beyond the start and stop nature of talks about talks, is this unprecedented 29th of February set of 2 agreements between the US government and the Taliban on the one hand and the government of Afghanistan on the other. This 2 sets of agreements are unprecedented in the 19 years of the conflict and are enabling, but in and by themselves insufficient to create the conditions for peace. What is remarkable is that in the last week alone, a number of developments, rare developments in the context of this conflict to unprecedented, for a couple of them, have really, I think, raised the possibility that a peace process may be underway well before the end of this calendar year. The outcome of that peace process is unclear, but let me walk you ever so briefly through these changes in the last week. First, we had a power sharing agreement between the 2 main contenders of last year's fractious presidential election in Afghanistan. Second, we had a ceasefire which lasted 3 days from Sunday till yesterday evening, a formal ceasefire around the Eid Islamic celebrations. Thirdly, we had a release of prisoners, and this is significant because it's the first time that there have been large batches of prisoners released in one go. And finally, we have seen, as a result of the power sharing agreement, the opposite numbers of the Taliban at the future negotiating table coming all together and agreeing to really end talks about intra-Afghan talks and enter really those talks very soon. The US has played a major role in corralling all these stakeholders, including by talking to the Taliban. But really what we have here is a situation which is unprecedented, and compared to the assessment, which is quite pessimistic in the book, we can, as of today, draw a slightly more optimistic assessment, even if it has to be a cautious one. There are plenty of potential spoilers. There are a complex set of expectations which need to be managed. The government expectations on all sides could change, including in the US government. But we could be looking at a situation where there could be a complete withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan by May 2021, in line with the broad lines of the 29th of February 2020 agreement.
Thank you, Antoine. Well, the other big story from your region in 2019 was Kashmir. And indeed, tension in and over the disputed region of Kashmir featured prominently, not only on the South Asian regional strategic agenda, but also on the international agenda. So with the early insight of 2020, how much of an inflection point do you think 2019 really was for the conflict in Kashmir?
Thank you. You have to look back at the details of what happened in 2019, and the book does a great job of this. It's full of data, and really it's worth taking a look. In 2019, the Kashmir Disputes gained global visibility, unprecedented in a generation. Just as violence levels rose and state-on-state tensions spiked. In February 1st, India and Pakistan made groundbreaking use of conventional military air power in each other's territories. Secondly, in August, a diplomatic standoff was prompted by India's decision to revoke the autonomy of its administered part of Kashmir and bifurcate that territory. The stakes were heightened as chance played a significant role in the first crisis, preventing further military escalation, and surprise played a large part in the second. Pakistan intensified as a result its global public diplomacy campaign to discredit India on its Kashmir policy, both as a foreign policy and domestic governance item, while its criticism of the Indian state's human security and law and order record in the region partially echoed criticism originating elsewhere in India and of course internationally. The Kashmir policies of major powers, and you did state that this was a major focus of the book this year, how these discrete conflicts relate to major powers. I think the Kashmir policies of major powers, including China, remain fundamentally unchanged in 2019, owing to their geopolitical and geoeconomic drivers. China, to take an example, has largely stood by Pakistan, and this is not a surprise. But these external powers also worried more about the new prospects for crisis dynamics to inadvertently escalate into a major state-on-state conflict in one of the world's most tense and heavily militarized regions. The book provides, again, more data on this for those of you who are interested. In 2020, the coronavirus emergency has so far slowed many of the strands of the strategic relations between India and Pakistan. But because that relationship is so notable for the absence of any regular meeting, set of meetings and diplomatic engagements since 2013-14, the pandemic has not really had an effect on anything. And on the ground, we're seeing more instances of declared ceasefire violations. So really there is a sense of heightened danger and escalation this year over that particular conflict. And really, this should not distract also from the fact that there is a cumulative effect which builds on many years of tensions which were really elevated by the developments of 2019. So in this sense, 2019 may well prove to be an inflection point in this conflict, but maybe not a strategic watershed.
Thank you, Antoine. I think with the remainder of the time, I'd like to try and answer some of the questions that have been sent by participants in this webinar. I'll try to group them together thematically. The first two really focus on the issues of mediation and conflict resolution. So these are really for everyone. Perhaps I will ask Emil to go first because they kind of link to what you were saying about UN mediation. So the first one is from Desmond Bowen, and it goes, in the absence of any successful international mediation, how do conflicts come to an end? Does armed force prevail with imposition of an easy peace? Do you have any examples to offer? And also John Rain is asking what trends, if any, we have seen in successful conflict resolution. In particular, does the increasingly fractured and chronic nature of conflict make the role of external actors in peacemaking more or less valuable? Emil, would you like to start on that one? Yeah. And then anyone could.
Well, thank you. I'm only qualified to discuss the Middle East, so I will do so by saying that there's no recent example of a successful mediation in the region. What we've had are tactical arrangements. I'll get back to this in a second. For instance, Hodeidah, there were ceasefires here and there, including during the Syrian conflict, but they never held. I think fundamentally to the question, how do conflicts come to an end? They come to an end when one side essentially wins. It doesn't have to be a total victory. It can be just enough so that the opposing side no longer poses a strategic threat to one's survival. This is an example in Syria, where the Assad regime hasn't won this magnificent, overwhelming, comprehensive victory, but it has decisively declawed the rebel, Kurdish, other challenges to its rule. So there's a big difference between what we would define as peace, success, and what the actors in their own arenas see as a good enough, satisfactory outcome. What we learned from Syria is that massive force can work, especially if it deters a counter-escalation by others. If the balance of interest of one side overwhelms the interests of the other side, then you have escalation dominance. This is a lesson that warring factions in Yemen or Libya won. In Libya, there is a sense among especially the supporters of Khalifa Haftar that, if you can get away with the kind of violence Russia has visited and Iran have visited onto Syria, why not Libya? And that's what we saw, is that the thresholds have changed. Same thing in Yemen. But in those two places, I think there are local and regional circumstances that have prevented the replication of this the scenario. Now, the international mediation can serve to either freeze the conflict, and we've seen examples of that. Sometimes it's sustainable, sometimes it's not. But it also sometimes serves as an imprimatur, a stamp. This side has won. Let's provide international legitimacy to that, so we can move on. This hasn't really happened at the moment. Certainly in Syria, we're getting close to that. Russia has an interest in a UN stamp on whatever comes up on the ground in Syria, because that would open the way for the rehabilitation of the Assad government, of funding for reconstruction, and so on. But there's no model. If you look, and this is not just in the armed conflict survey of this year, but in strategic survey of last year, there's also a big study looking at the variety of mandates and UN peace endeavors and so on. They change massively in terms of their strengths, in terms of the leverage behind them, in terms of the cost and the constraint imposed on various parties, and so on. And there's still no and I suspect there will never be any template for success. I go back and I'll finish on that one, on the Hodeidah example. Hodeidah in 2018 was perhaps the burning front in Yemen and the center of massive international attention. And to some extent, the deal over Hodeidah happened because of a convergence of factors. One of them is, without the Emirati-led campaign to take Hodeidah, the UN envoy wouldn't necessarily have had the leverage on the Houthis to get this deal. It's not a perfect deal. It's been challenged. The monitoring mission on the ground has issues and so on, but it has averted the worst case scenario that a number of people were contemplating. Another factor in this was that at the time, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but especially Saudi Arabia, were coming under international attention and pressure because of the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, because of the US Congress mobilizing around the issue of arms sales and so on. So you had factors outside the UN process per se that did have an impact on how the leading external forces, on the appetite of leading external forces there. It hasn't been necessarily the case, for instance, in Syria, where some countries did operate without any constraints. So yeah, it's a long answer just to say that if there's any successful mediation in the Middle East that I've missed, please let me know. Otherwise I have nothing for you.
Thank you. Anyone would like to come in on this? Antonio.
So in the case of Colombia, Colombia had a very recent example of conflict resolution or a mechanism of resolving conflict with FARC, which was the peace agreement. And in that case, external mediation did play a very important role and positive role, I would say, in the way that the negotiations took place in Cuba, which is a government that has some ideological and political alignment with FARC. It had the support of Venezuela and Chile, two countries with very different political systems and philosophies. And also had the support, the technical support in terms of conflict mediation from the Norwegian government. But then again, Latin America is a very different environment in which I would say that regional tensions are less than those in the Middle East, and intervention of one country in the other's internal affairs and security environment are reduced. And the Colombia example is also displays the potential and the limitations of the traditional conflict resolution, because the peace agreement with FARC was pretty much by the book. It was very successful in demobilizing fighters, in establishing systems and official processes to register, count, demobilize, destroy weapons. Many weapons were turned even into art exhibitions and monuments, and there were public festivities around it. But what we saw later is that the illicit economies and the remaining weakness of state authority and socioeconomic development on the ground have been drivers of continued mobilization into armed groups. So dissident FARC fighters, which were initially very limited, very marginal in the peace process, gained strength and gained territory. The ELN, the remaining guerrilla group, saw that initially people thought that the ELN would be extremely weakened because the government forces would be entirely focused on the ELN as the last remaining insurgent group in Latin America. And actually, the group was able to gain some strength and revenue and territory along the Venezuelan border, exploiting the socioeconomic gaps and this weakness of state authority in some areas. So I think it's not entirely a negative or positive dynamic, but indeed armed groups, especially non-state armed groups, have retained quite a lot of resilience and capacity to adapt.
Thank you. Antoine, you wanted to come in as well on this one?
Yes, thank you. A very quick point about Afghanistan. I mean, one of the unsung successes of the what I call military diplomatic engagement which the US has been leading on Afghanistan is the extent to which in the last few years there has been a patient network of regional relations which have been geared towards really ensuring that the most conducive diplomatic conditions existed around Afghanistan and more broader afield between major powers, so that reconciliation was made possible. Anything from bilateral to 6+2 formats resurrected from the 1990s. And this is partly down to, of course, a degree of coordination of different self-interests by neighbors who do not wish to see Afghanistan go back to its 1990s ghosts. But it does take some degree of coordination, and it's notable that some major international opponents or countries in contestation with each other in other fields are actually having very productive conversations around Afghanistan. US, China, to an extent, US, Iran. There is no dialogue between India and Pakistan, but there seemed to be some degree of understanding around each other's red lines. And this is all very essential. So that's the lesson. Take care of your region if you want to solve an intra-state conflict.
Thank you, Antoine. I'm very conscious of the time, but I'm also conscious of the fact that we have 13, 14 questions lined up, and 5 of those are all COVID related. So I will abuse my prerogative as the chair to extend the webinar a little bit and group these questions together. So the members of the audience are asking questions whether COVID is having an impact on UN operations, the pandemic in Western countries, is that going to have an impact on their ability to contribute to conflict? And one of the participants is even asking, well, is actually the pandemic going to dampen those conflicts, because the conflict parties will be focusing on addressing the challenges of the pandemic? Perhaps I will invite people who haven't spoken yet in this second round to go first. Nella and perhaps Aaron afterwards.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we've seen a lot of different activities and responses around conflict. To address the question of the UN first, I think it is going to have be a significant inhibitor to UN operations and more broadly to humanitarian operations. So to cite one quite recent example, we've seen a huge amount of anger directed against UN staff and UN troops in South Sudan because UN peacekeepers, either UN peacekeepers or UN staff, were among the first to test positive for coronavirus. So it's not certain that the UN effectively introduced coronavirus to South Sudan, but we can't ignore the possibility either. And given the highly mobile nature of UN operations, it is going to restrict a lot of what they can do. It's going to expose the UN to a lot of possible terrible publicity and certainly mistrust. And again, in the South Sudan case, you could see there were a great deal of threats made against UN staff on social media. So it is without a doubt going to have a very complex layered effects on UN operations. To extend that point a bit more broadly to humanitarian operations, one of the things that I'm personally concerned about over the years, we've seen as a result of counterterrorism legislation, something of a reluctance of humanitarian groups to operate in non-state group controlled areas. There's all sorts of ethical reasons about why that's obviously very problematic, but I think the pandemic goes to show one of the biggest risks. This is not something that's going to respect the boundaries between state and non-state group controlled land. So the questions of access for efforts to stop the spread of the pandemic are going to become extremely important in the next few months.
Thank you. Aaron, would you like to come in on this?
Sure. You know, it's there have been two efforts by members of the UN Security Council to reach an agreement on a kind of statement that would encourage a ceasefire in Rakhine State, one in early February, just as the pandemic was picking up, that wasn't really related. And then one that was a little bit more urgent recently in early May. And both of those resolutions failed because of opposition from China and Russia. And so the gridlock on the UN Security Council that seems to affect almost everything these days is certainly affecting the situation in Myanmar. And that's been the case now for about 3 years since things in Rakhine State began to get really bad. I mean, the UN agencies, specialized agencies, specifically World Food Program and World Health Organization, are pretty key in Myanmar. And last month, we saw a WHO vehicle that was carrying COVID-19, or I should say blood samples or samples for testing for COVID-19 in Rakhine State, was attacked. Both the Tatmadaw and the American Army accused the other of having attacked the vehicle, but the driver, who was a Myanmar national, was killed. The World Food Program is absolutely critical in Rakhine State to being able to feed vulnerable populations, of which there are around 200,000. And its work has been impeded both by the fighting, the continued fighting, and by COVID. And then on the other side of the border in Bangladesh, we've just in recent weeks begun to see COVID-19 cases pop up in the Rohingya refugee camps. This is still the largest refugee camp in the world, around 900,000 people, and living in very tight quarters. The international community has spent around $2.5 billion over the last 3 years to try and make those communities safe from waterborne illnesses, from landslides, but they never anticipated that they would also have to deal with a global pandemic. And if those cases, if there's a sort of super spreader case in the Rohingya refugee camps in the next several weeks to months, that could be absolutely devastating for the Rohingya population. And it will have been because Myanmar has not created the conditions on the ground to enable the return of Rohingya to Myanmar. And so these delays, which I think Myanmar thought that the international community should be willing to tolerate over a long period of time, may have really grievous consequences beyond the tens of thousands who died in the Myanmar Armed Forces violence in 2017.
Thank you, Aaron. Anyone else who would like to come in? Emil.
Yes, so the role of the various UN agencies is quite controversial in a number of Middle Eastern conflicts, but no more so than in Syria, where the WHO has come under criticism for years for how it operates there, as well as other agencies. Of course, their mandate is limited, and the principle there is that you work primarily through the government in place in Damascus. And the government itself is posing a lot of restrictions on the aid that can be distributed across the country and so on. And this has also affected the WHO effectiveness and its ability to collect tests, send them to laboratories, process them in time, send enough tests, promote the right measures, and so on. So the COVID-19 crisis has actually exacerbated existing problems of access, credibility of the UN in a number of places. The other issue here is whether the COVID-19 crisis at a strategic level will erode the willingness of major donor countries to continue funding a number of those initiatives that are key. In Syria, we're talking about around 6 million IDPs and approximately 6 million refugees. That's more than half of the population. The number of people who need some kind of UN help is around, I think, 18 million. So large numbers. Yemen is another good example of that. So the UN is seen as very politicized in a number of places, has never been able to totally fill its appeal, its humanitarian appeals for the various conflicts. And in the ACS, we actually show how each conflict is actually able to attract the kind of humanitarian assistance needed or not, and in most cases it's not. So you have those two issues. There's another aspect here, whether the pandemic will serve to dampen conflict. And I think actually it's an important one. I think in a very, perverse, perhaps twisted way, the pandemic offers a life-saving way out for some countries to say, we have no interest in escalation right now. We can afford to take a step back. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has unilaterally offered a ceasefire in Yemen. The Houthis didn't, took their time. They accepted it, then didn't accept it, etc. But Saudi Arabia itself was willing to take a step back, but it didn't know how to politically and diplomatically. And in the way the pandemic helped at this level to, figure out a way to reduce its military involvement. I'm not suggesting that this will lead to a resolution, but as a de-escalation, it helps in some places de-escalation. Obviously, in Libya, it hasn't. The past few months in Libya have been among the most violent of the entire conflict, because Khalifa Haftar and his troops made it all the way to Tripoli, and there was massive urban warfare. And then, Turkey's intervention helped push back this advance. But this is a hot conflict zone at the moment. So there, the COVID didn't play a role.
Well, thank you, Emil. Unless there are any burning comments that my colleagues must make, I really need to bring this to a close. Thank you very much for all those who tuned in and submitted many questions, and apologies to those questions we were unable to answer. It's clear that there is plenty of interest about COVID. What we will do tomorrow, alongside from sharing the recordings of the webinar, we'll also share a list of links to the most recent publications, podcasts, and other webinars that ISS has produced that focus on different aspects of COVID and how it impacts different regions and foreign relations, etc. So hopefully you find that useful. So as I said, the recording will be also available on our website and also on our YouTube channel in about 24 hours. Also on our website, you'll find more information about the book, well, also on Amazon, of course. And really, what is left to say is a big thank you to the colleagues who have joined us today, but also to the many ISS colleagues that work tirelessly throughout the year, not just in research, but publication, communication, etc., and make the Armed Conflict Survey possible. So thank you very much, and see you at the next ISS webinar. Goodbye.